dear guests and students, it is my great pleasure today to introduce to you one of the most original thinkers of anthropology today, Professor Dr. Joel Robbins. We are very honored that he has agreed to deliver this year's Adolf Ellegaard Jensen lecture series, and we very warmly welcome him here in Frankfurt at the Frobenius Institute. Thank you. In the coming 4 lectures on each Monday this month, Professor Robbins will discuss some core issues he has been dealing with since the beginning of his career: the anthropology of values. Values are difficult to conceptualize. On the one hand, everybody has values. On the other hand, anthropologists are well aware of the competition between various values worldwide and the obvious differences between sein and sollen, be and ought to be in any concrete social situation. Many anthropologists have provided elaborate descriptions of norms and values in their particular communities, but rather few have used their insights to formulate general theories about the role of values in relation to social change. Professor Robbins is one of these exceptions. I became aware of his work only a few years ago when I read an article written by him and Jukka Sikala from Helsinki University on hierarchy and hybridity towards a Dumontian approach to contemporary cultural change. In this paper, both authors argue that Louis Dumont's writings provide key analytical concepts for understanding cultural change. This argument came to me as a nice surprise. I myself had for years been struggling hard to defend my fascination for Dumontian theories against many German colleagues, some of whom despised and many continue to reject any form of structuralism. Since the end of the 90s, many anthropologists in Germany turned their back on any grand theory. Might this be functionalism, Marxism, symbolism, or structuralism? All these isms were rejected as too rigid, impersonal, and useless when trying to explain social change. The theoretical trend in Germany turned towards processes rather than structures, towards negotiation and agency rather than culture, towards individual choices rather than systems of meaning. This was, of course, a reaction towards the critique of Louis Dumont's theory of binary oppositions and his universalism. In a published interview, Professor Robbins describes that at a certain point in his career, he also experienced a need for reintegrating history and action into a theory of structure, and that he turned towards the same 2 authors that my colleagues and I discovered under the guidance of Professor Pfeffer at the University of Berlin, namely Louis Dumont and Marshall Sahlins. In this interview, Professor Robbins describes how he first encountered the writings of Dumont in his graduate classes at the University of Virginia in the 1980s. At that time, symbolism was still a major theory in this public Ivy University, where renowned anthropologists like Roy Wagner, Susan McKinnon, Fred Damon, and Ravindra Kare were teaching. Kare acquainted him with the most challenging book of Dumont, his Homo Hierarchicus. At first, this work did not leave a big impression on him, because the arguments seemed to resemble those made by Lévi-Strauss in his paper, Do Dual Organizations Exist? Fortunately, he had an excellent teacher like Roy Wagner, who made him read the book a second time. Professor Robbins describes this encounter with his teacher in the following way. I quote, "A week or so later, I shared my conclusions, in brackets, about the value of Dumont's work, in a meeting with my doctoral advisor, Roy Wagner. Now, Roy is a gentle person and not very explicitly directive as an advisor, which means the few times he ever spoke sternly to me all made a strong impression." I think I have to remember this strategy, it's very useful. His response to my claim that I was not sure Dumont taught me anything I had not learned from Lévi-Strauss was one of those rare moments. As best as I can remember, he said something like, "You are wrong. Dumont is a dialectical thinker. Go back and read him again," unquote. He obviously followed his advice and found in Dumont's writings, including from Marx to Mandeville and essays on individualism, ideas that others had ignored. While many contemporaries simply dismissed Dumont as just another structuralist using rigid oppositions and ignoring historical processes, Professor Robbins realized that Dumont's theory of values, and especially his discussion of the rise of the value of the individual in Christianity, provides us with good analytical tools for understanding change, in particular radical change, which Professor Robbins encountered in Papua New Guinea. From 1991 to 1993, he had spent 27 months of field work among the Urap Min. At that time, the small ethnic group consisted of only about 400 people living in 7 villages. About 13 years before Professor Robbins first encountered them, the Urap Min had undergone radical change because they had converted to Christianity under the influence of charismatic revivalism. In the 1970s, the Urap Min had sent some of their young boys to neighboring communities to learn more about Christianity from Baptists, and as a consequence, they gave up their traditional religion completely. With Christianity, their minds became concerned with avoiding a sinful life, with individual action, and with millennial expectations. On the other hand, Professor Robbins discovered a continued relevance and high evaluation of social relations among the Urap Min. In this situation, Professor Robbins asked himself how he could bring together theories of structure and still account for the radical change he was observing. Dumont's writings offered one solution to this dilemma because Dumont argues that societies undergo structural changes when their values change. Dumont himself describes this in relation to the history of Christianity in Europe, which in his view exemplifies the transformation of the value of holism to the value of the individual. On the basis of his studies among the Urap Min, Professor Robbins adds to this another paramount value that he calls relationalism. It is the idea that relationships in themselves are good and valuable, not only as instruments for individual goals. The second author that helped in overcoming the opposition between structure and change was, of course, Marshall Sahlins, who in his Islands of History argues for a theory of change that starts from the recognition of existing structures. The fieldwork in Papua New Guinea resulted in a monograph entitled, I quote, "Becoming Sinners, Christianity and Moral Torment in a Papua New Guinea Society," which was published by the University of California Press and won him the J.I. Staley Prize of the School of Advanced Research. It was reviewed in 25 different papers published in major anthropological journals, among them also Paideumer, the journal of the Frobenius Institute. In the following years, Professor Robbins continued to develop anthropological theory on the basis of his fieldwork in Papua New Guinea and contributed substantial new ideas to the anthropology of Christianity, as well as to debates about morality or values. His very, very impressive list of publications contains numerous articles published in major anthropological journals, as well as dozens of book chapters and edited volumes dealing with a very wide range of topics. Many of these works were produced while Professor Robbins was employed at the University of California, San Diego, from 1998 to 2013. In 2013, he was selected as Sigrid Rausing Professor of Social Anthropology at Cambridge University. And this has, I think, immensely increased the impact of his work and writings on European anthropologists. Similar to Dumont, Professor Robbins can be called a dialectical thinker who brings together opposites in order to create new synthesis. This is very obvious in his writings on morality and values. While other writers either understand values as prompts for emotions and desires, or in the Durkheimian tradition as norms inherent in any social action, he brings both sides together in a theory of value, which also recognizes, by the way, the writings of Max Weber on value conflicts. Marshall Sahlins once characterized him well, I think, when he wrote, I quote, "Robbins is very unusual among his generation in being able to walk the walk of the most trendy deep thinkers without having to talk their talk." Wow, what a quote. We are therefore very glad to have you here today, Professor Robbins, and listen how you talk your talk. This series is generously sponsored by the Frobenius Society and organized by the Frobenius Institute. I would like to express my thanks to all those who helped us in preparing this event, especially to Dr. Meyer-Wegerlin, Mrs. Hühnlich, and Mrs. Janti Hölzchen. And at the end of my speech, I would like to invite you again, if you have not heard about it already, to the summer symposium, which will take place in a couple of days on the 15th of June, again here in the casino. At 2 o'clock, we start here with lectures by young scholars, doctoral and postdoctoral scholars. We'll have a film on India at the end, and afterwards a wonderful buffet. Today, our plan is after the lecture by Professor Dorel Robbins, we will have also a wonderful buffet here, sponsored generously by the Frobenius Society and organized by Dr. Richard Kuba and his wife, and we will have, I think, a wonderful African buffet here. And now I think it's time for me to leave. Professor Robbins, welcome again to Frankfurt. The floor belongs to you. Thank you.
Greetings, everyone. I should begin by thanking Professor Hardenberg for that wonderful introduction, which was so accurate and sympathetic that I fear in my lecture today I will just sound like I'm repeating you. But no, thank you very much, and that was a wonderful way to begin. I'm extremely honored to be able to give this year's Jensen lectures. I actually have what for me, in any case, is a long engagement with the Frobenius Institute. In fact, my very first international academic conference was one that I was invited to by Professor Kohl and by Professor Yibins. It took place in Denmark, but on cargo cults. I don't know if either of you remember that, but that was my first international conference. And then, because anthropology is an empirical discipline, I actually checked my CV this afternoon, and the first ever international talk I gave was at the Frobenius Institute in the year 2000, when it was still on Liebigstrasse. So I feel a long connection, and I have had several articles in Paiduma, and I feel a long connection to this institute. I also, of course, am honored to join in the lineage of the previous Frobenius lecturers who absolutely set a very high standard. I see that with E.P. Thompson and Adam Smith on the blackboard here, perhaps Chris Gregory has just left the building, but I very much thank Professor Hardenberg for this invitation, and I very much look forward to the dialogue that comes out of these lectures. So thank you to everyone who made this possible. Like Frobenius's celebrated student, Adolf Jensen, I am also an anthropologist of religion. And I'm also an anthropologist of religion whose research is focused, in fact, on root crop cultivators. In my case, taro and yam cultivators in the highlands of Papua New Guinea, the Urapmin that Professor Hardenberg mentioned. As will become clear shortly, I am also like Jensen in that I am concerned with what, in one of his pieces that was published in English, he calls the desire people have to actively fit into the perceived order of the world. And with the role not only that people's cognitive ideas about that order, but also their emotional faculties have in driving them toward this goal, to fitting into the perceived order of the world. I will also touch on religion quite a bit in these lectures, drawing on some of my own ethnographic examples from this domain and examples from other scholars. But I should be clear from the outset that these lectures are not most centrally about religion. Instead, this set of lectures aims to formulate an anthropological theory of values that draws on, but is different from, some of those theories that have come before it. And among other things, I will argue that values create, as Jensen would have it, the orders of the world into which people actively try to fit, while values also at the same time create the motivations that propel people's desires to fit in this way. So that's where I'm headed in these lectures. And I'm going to turn now to begin talking about values. But I should say that today's lecture is more wholly theoretical and also intellectual historical about anthropology as a field than the other lectures will be. Today I aim to lay some foundations on which other lectures will build, both theoretically and ethnographically. I mention this as a final introductory remark so that those of you who find yourselves regretting the rather light ethnographic content of this lecture will know that the others will be more balanced between theory and ethnographic illustration than this one is. So I hope if the largely historical and theoretical tone today isn't your cup of tea, that you'll know that the others will sound a bit different. But with those introductory remarks in place, let me begin. As anthropologists, we know that people living in different social formations care about and want to realize different things. We know, that is, that they hold different values. We know, for example, that Melanesians care a lot about making and maintaining social relations, and that this leads them to practice all kinds of exchanges that, when viewed through the Western lens, look rather odd. They often look odd to us in part because they stress the equality between the persons involved by having all parties end up receiving pretty much the same kinds of things that they've given. Where I worked amongst the Urapmin in Papua New Guinea, this often takes the form, after people have had disputes, of the two parties to a dispute putting in a lot of effort to collecting exactly the same things so that they can give them to each other at the same time. Perhaps I would collect 5,000 euros and give it to someone who would give me 5,000 euros in the same kinds of bills at the same time. As one of my school-educated friends among the European once put it to me when talking about these kind of exchanges of exactly equivalent items, he said, well, you know, these exchanges have no profit. He had that word in Tocqueville, and he said, these exchanges have no profit, of course, imagining what I must think of them. But of course, they do have a profit if what you value is relationships, and especially if you value relationships that establish the equality between people. By contrast with what we often think about Melanesian relationships, we've come to learn more recently and more forcefully than we had before from scholars like James Ferguson and Naomi Haynes that many people in southern Africa put a great deal of effort into making and maintaining relations between patrons and clients that are hierarchical, and that even those at the bottom of such hierarchies vastly prefer such unequal relations that connect them with more powerful patrons to other more balanced kind of relations they might have with their equals. And finally, just by way of illustration, we've known for a long time, of course, that North Americans, at least, sticking to the place I still know best, most want to create free individuals for whom profit is crucial as it provides them with the means to become who they most uniquely are. These individuals also form many kinds of relationships, but most of those relationships aim to help them meet the goal of becoming who they are, of becoming the kind of individuals that they want to be. So Melanesians, Africans, and North Americans all have relationships. Indeed, it's part of the human condition to have relationships. But they all want different things out of the relationships they participate in. Or, in the language that I will use in these lectures, they all want their relationships to realize different values. Of course, my point is not that Melanesians only value equal relationships, Africans only hierarchical ones, or North Americans only those relationships that enhance their individual liberty. Nor is my point that all of these people only value relationships of one kind or another. People's lives are complex, and their values are never singular. But I do contend that the arrangement of the societies in which these and other people live does reflect the values that they hold to be most important, including the kinds of values I've just briefly described that surround what relationships are for. And I also would want to assert, quoting Edward Fisher, an anthropologist, that, quote, when viewed over the expanse of a lifetime, certain values tend to orient people's engagement with the world. The point of these lectures is to promote the kind of anthropology that cares a lot about the differences between the values that orient and order the lives of people living in different social formations. I hope to promote this kind of anthropology by developing an approach to the study of values that shows them to be central both to the ways societies are structured and to the ways people negotiate their lives within these structures. I told you I was going to sound like I was repeating the introduction, but I guess anthropology is a predictive science. So that's where I'm headed, toward laying out a theory that helps us understand both how values shape the structures in which people live and also shapes how they negotiate their lives within these structured worlds. Before I begin to lay out such a theory, however, I think it's worth asking why now is a good time to develop a theory of values. Why now should we be interested in this project? And I'm going to offer two answers to that question. The first is intellectual historical, and it has to do with the current state of the discipline of anthropology. And to describe that state, I'm going to turn to a recent article by the very well-known anthropologist Sherry Ortner. I'm guessing many of you have read one article or another by Professor Ortner. For the last 45 years, which is an amazing expanse of time to do this, Ortner has arguably been one of the 2 or 3 ablest chroniclers of the shifting anthropological zeitgeist. She's been able to predict and follow where anthropologists are going for almost 5 decades now. And she several times displayed a kind of amazing ability to take the temperature of the discipline, to know which ways the winds that direct anthropology are blowing. In 1973, before I really came anywhere near the discipline, and so this paper may be the least well-known to some younger people here, she published a well-known article called On Key Symbols that perfectly captured the growing confidence of the kind of symbolic analysis that was at that time settling into a period of comfortable centrality in the field. Then, in 1984, in her even more famous piece, Theory in Anthropology Since the 1960s, Ortner accurately reported that the heyday of symbolic and structural anthropology was coming to an end. In response to its limitations, she told us, practice theory, with its interest in issues both of action and power, was set to succeed this kind of symbolic anthropology she'd 10 years earlier kind of put at the center of the discipline. After another decade had passed, so she writes Theory in Anthropology Since the 1960s in 1984. After another decade in 1995, she once again gave voice to the emerging spirit of the times. This was in an article entitled Resistance and the Problem of Ethnographic Refusal. In that paper, she told us that one of the most successful versions of practice theory, what was known then as the Anthropology of Resistance, had largely left its ethnographic focus behind, and for that reason was destined to fade from the scene, which, as if taking orders from her, it promptly did. Within 3 or 4 years, nobody wanted to talk about resistance. Then, quite recently, after a 20-year gap, so she'd been doing this every 10 years, she waited 20 years, and in 2016, she once again weighed in on the state of anthropology by publishing an already very well-known piece called Dark Anthropology and Its Others, Theory Since the 80s. As its title suggests, this article picks up where Theory Since the 60s left off. And in this piece, Ortner tells us that contemporary anthropology is primarily a response to the global dominance of the neoliberal order. Anthropology now, she says, documents the inequalities this neoliberal order has produced and the exercises of power those at the top of that order regularly employ to protect and further entrench their position. Anthropology now, that is to say, focuses on the darkness of contemporary life, which it takes to be the correct way to proceed, given what she calls harsh realities of power in play everywhere anthropologists seem to look. Quoting her, she tells us, quote, "It is hard to overstate the degree to which these issues of power, domination, inequality, and oppression have come to dominate the field." The theoretical inspirations of this dark anthropology, Ortner adds, are Marx and Foucault. In relying on these masters, she goes on to tell us, anthropologists have largely pushed aside the influence of Durkheim and Weber, who had been so central to the symbolic anthropology she so well represented in that early landmark piece from '73 on key symbols. These founding fathers, Weber, Durkheim, she observes, simply fail in most cases to give us the tools we need to understand the dark world that exists wherever we go today, and so now it's Marx and Foucault who are our master thinkers. I think it's fair to say that Ortner has done it again. She's accurately diagnosed the main direction of travel of contemporary anthropology, or I should add, of Anglophone anthropology. And I'd be interested to talk later, if people want to, about whether this accurately represents anthropology, say in Germany or in other places that people know best. But it does make a lot of sense of Anglophone anthropology. Many Anglophone scholars, at least now, are scholars of darkness, as much or more than they're scholars of anything else. It's also probably fair to say that despite its accuracy, the article Dark Anthropology isn't as courageously out in front of the discipline as these earlier articles had been. In those articles, Ortner was being somewhat prophetic. She was telling us what the limitations of current anthropology were and what was coming next. This article is more a piece of reportage. Dark Anthropology had already won the day. The Owl of Minerva had already flown, we could say, before Sherry Ortner told us what was what. When she wrote about the shift to practice theory, for example, in the Anthropology of Power, the triumph of those views over symbolic anthropology wasn't apparent. And when she took on resistance theory and said that it had major problems, many people still practiced it. But dark anthropology had been dominant for a while by the time Ortner's 2016 article appeared. And in that article, she's more reporting a shift than she is helping to bring it about. Indeed, in the article itself, Ortner implicitly tells us this because she recognizes that dark anthropology, by the time she was writing, had already been around long enough to have produced its own resistance movement, a resistance movement in response to its dominance. And she borrowed a term from an article of mine, actually, to name this counter-movement. She called these resistant approaches anthropologies of the good. Quoting me, she mentions anthropological studies of value as part of this trend, this counter-movement toward anthropologies of the good. But in discussing such work, she doesn't really dwell on the values part of it, but she dwells on some other parts of it, anthropologies of happiness and of ethics. In the end, she doesn't seem to find much promise in this work on the good in the form of ethics or happiness, not to mention values. Instead, she argues that dark anthropology really has its own anthropology of the good, and that anthropology is focused not on those topics, but rather on people's resistance to, critique of, and activism against the dark neoliberal orders in which they find themselves. What she calls the anthropology of critique, resistance, and activism, quoting her, she asserts is the truly valuable anthropology of the good because it's this kind of work that will help us, quote, imagine better ways of living and better futures, close quote, that might replace the current dark ways of living that anthropologists are documenting everywhere. If we don't work to produce such kinds of imagination of new futures, Ortner wonders, quote, what is the point of opposing neoliberalism? If we can't put anything in its place, why oppose it? In fact, this claim is sufficiently important to her that she returns to it in her conclusion, emphasizing that what we really need are, quote, studies that emphasize thinking about alternative political and economic futures by studying resistance, activism, and critique. I think I share what we might as well call Ortner's values, as she articulates them in this conclusion. I also think anthropology ought to inform us about other ways of living than those we know all too well. And it ought to do so in the kind of depth that allows us to consider such ways of life as genuine alternatives to those with which we are most familiar. Indeed, the article of mine from which Ortner takes the notion of the anthropology of the good is built around the argument that the move to certain kinds of dark anthropology, in particular the anthropology of suffering, turns its back on the traditional anthropological concern with different ways of life, and in doing so loses what I claim is anthropology's most unique and important critical potential. But Ortner doesn't take up that argument from my piece. In fact, she rather performs the problem that I diagnosed. That is, despite a perfunctory insistence that neoliberalism isn't the same everywhere, in her article, Ortner has nothing concrete to say about different ways of life, not even about specifically different ways of critiquing neoliberalism and the different futures that such criticisms might lead us to imagine. In a world that is dark and getting darker, Ortner ends up treating all lives as pretty equally gray. Ortner's disregard for difference, once again, displays her uncanny accuracy, I think, for determining where anthropology is. Because I think, in fact, her disregard for difference follows a general dark anthropological disregard for difference. But I also think that this disregard for difference is a problem. For if we study only darkness, we are not likely to find any kinds of light. We are unlikely to discover the kinds of alternatives Ortner claims a proper anthropology of the good should seek to find. If we study similarly dark worlds everywhere, that is to say, and focus only on their darkness and the often failed attempts people make to fight against such darkness, we're missing the chance to study in action kinds of lives we might want to suggest are more worth living than the ones neoliberalism allows. Without a keen eye for difference, the anthropological gift for critique by comparative denaturalization of taken-for-granted ways of life loses its force. If we can't talk about different ways of living, we're not going to be able to perform our traditional critical task of making people stop taking their own ways of life for granted. Ortner's protestations to the contrary, I do not think dark anthropology is very successful in helping us imagine better ways of living and better futures. It doesn't at least do that in convincing detail by producing rich accounts of the different ways people live. And I do not think her version of the anthropology of the good, as an anthropology of resistance and critique, is poised to change this situation very radically. In a way I hope to show throughout these lectures, but can only really lay out theoretically in the last lecture, I think a robust anthropology of values can help us recover our ability to foster this kind of powerful imagination in a way that dark anthropology can't. It can help us do so by focusing on the different kinds of things people living in different social formations care about, and how it is they work positively to bring into existence the kinds of lives they value. Put otherwise, I'm going to argue that the study of values is crucial to the recovery of an effective anthropology of difference. Even the study of resistance and critique, I want to suggest, will have to develop ways of thinking systematically about the values that underlie such practices in any given case. If it's to be more than a kind of piecemeal, case-by-case enterprise that continually reminds us of the fact that many people do not currently accept the situations in which they live, but does not tell us much about how they might live differently. In summary, then, it is precisely because anthropology is so drawn to darkness at the moment that I think we need an anthropology of values now, perhaps more than we ever have in the past. So that's one reason it'd be good to have an anthropology of values now. But just in case you don't like that reason, or even if you do like that reason, there is also a second reason I think now is a good time to develop an anthropological theories of values, an anthropological theory of values. And the second reason is that I think it's fair to say there is, at the moment, no agreed upon dominant theory in this area. It's not like we already have an agreed upon anthropological theory of values. Though the words value and values never completely fall out of the anthropological vocabulary, and at present, value in the singular shows up often enough in passing, oddly enough, often in the title of books that then go on to say nothing about value in their contents. Even though the word never dies out, sustained theoretical work on this topic is hard to find at present. In fact, I think the situation as regards values as a theoretical topic remains much as Frederick Barth described it in 1993, when he noted that, it's worth quoting him here, values are at best discreetly introduced into the discipline's descriptive prose without receiving due recognition in the theoretical framework. I think it's a very, very precise and important point. And it's interesting to think about why at any given time in anthropology you can use some words as if they don't require any theoretical discussion and other words don't work that way. Values these days, you can throw it in without anybody asking you, well, what do you mean by values? What's your theory of values? I should add that when Barth makes this point in 1993, that values doesn't receive due recognition in the theoretical framework, he does point out that this hasn't always been the case. He notes that in the 1950s and 1960s, the American anthropologist Clyde Kluckhohn led a major project that aimed at putting values at the center of anthropological thought by rendering them the key to understanding how individual subjects make choices about how to act. And then not long after that project died out, leaving, interestingly enough, almost no legacy, Louis Dumont, working in the French context, as Professor Hardenberg has mentioned, developed what is probably the most fully realized anthropological theories of values, a theory that focused on the ways values structure ideological wholes and the social worlds to which they give shape. And in the United States, this is largely after Barth had written, or he might actually take notice of the very beginnings of this work. But anyway, in the United States, toward the end of the period of Dumont's greatest influence, Terence Turner and Nancy Munn at the University of Chicago developed a sophisticated approach to value, a term they tend to use in the singular. Their approach was much more strongly influenced by the Marxist traditions than Cluckone's or Dumont's had been, and it focused on value as the thing that people make efforts to produce in the greatest quantities that they can. This theoretical position was later further articulated and rendered influential by Turner and Munn's student, David Graeber. In constructing an approach to values in this lecture, I'm going to draw selectively on these three bodies of work on the subject. A little bit on Cluckone, quite a bit on Dumont, and at some strategic points on the Turner-Munn kind of Graeber line. But I'm also, as it were, going to go back behind these approaches to gather resources from older traditions in the social sciences and also a little bit from philosophy. Among others, I'm going to go against Sherry Ortner's prediction and draw on Durkheim and Weber, precisely the theorists she's told us don't belong in the current dark anthropological epoch. Okay? More generally, I'm going to be eclectic in the sources I deploy, taking inspiration from a wide range of places. But I hope that the kind of picture I try to put together out of all these different parts can be judged by its coherence in its own terms, not as a representation of any one of the strands on which it draws. So having tried to address the question of why study values now, why is this a topic that anthropology should finally move from the descriptive level to the theoretical level, I'm going to begin the constructive work of these lectures. That is, the effort to develop an explicitly articulated anthropological theory of values suitable to the discipline's present need for some kind of anthropology of the good that can complement its dominant trend toward documenting the darkness of so many contemporary lives. I think it's always good practice to begin the exploration of a topic by considering how to define that topic. And for reasons that'll become apparent in a moment, I'm going to have to begin to talk about values by offering not one, but two definitions. I think I've always heard it's an ancient Chinese proverb, but I really don't know where it's from, that a person with two clocks actually never knows what time it is. It might be nicer to have just one definition, but as you'll see, for what I'm trying, the groundwork I want to lay today, it's the fact that I need two that's going to be the hint, I think, to how we might want to develop this theory of values. So let me give you the two theories, the two definitions that I'm going to work with in these lectures. The first definition that I'm going to mention is fairly well known among anthropologists who work on values, and it comes from Clyde Cluckone. I'm going to read his definition here. I don't expect it to make a whole lot of sense as it's read, and I'm going to unpack it right away, but it's good to hear it in the original. It's very short, and so this is Cluckone, and it is a definition. It has the virtue of putting it right out there. A value is a conception, explicit or implicit, distinctive of an individual or characteristic of a group, of the desirable, which influences the selection from available modes, means, and ends of action. Geertz lifted a lot of phrases from Cluckone, including models of, models for. I realize reading this aloud, you can almost hear the Geertzian rhythm in there. So let me read it one more time. A value is a conception, explicit or implicit, distinctive of an individual or characteristic of a group, of the desirable, which influences the selection from available modes, means, and ends of action. It's a complex definition. It's got this cognitive aspect, values are conception, and then it says these whatever they are cognitively, they also influence practice by driving choice making, which he talks about in terms of selection. So it's a very complicated definition, but I just want to focus on one word in it, which is that values tell people what is desirable. I want to focus on that word desirable. It's important to know that for Cluckone, desirable is not the same thing as desired. In Cluckone's view, we all have all kinds of desires. But values point to the things we think or feel or maybe just know, we should desire, and that we assume others around us also think it's good to desire. And let me put this another way. Values are second-order desires. They're desires about what we want to desire. They're desires about what we think we should desire. So, for example, you're sitting in this lecture, you might have, I'm sure somebody has, a very strong desire to look at your cell phone, or to chat with the person next to you, or maybe even to walk out, all right? But you know that what you should desire is listen to me. I'm counting on that. The value in this situation is listening to the lecture. And perhaps that's part of a slightly more robust value of kind of being a good academic or a good lecture participant. That's what it's right to desire. And that's what you could tell others around you that you desire without penalty, without getting in any trouble. If you leaned over to somebody and said, I really want to walk out, they'd say, yeah, why don't you not? He's probably going to be done soon, right? You'd get some kind of little sanction, as Durkheim would say, but you can desire to listen to the lecture without any problem. If you shush somebody next to you because you want to hear, you'll always be in the right. For Kluckhohn, values are those kind of things that people know in a second-order way are right to desire, that are desirable in that sense. And it's as these kind of second-order desires about what we should desire, that they shape how people choose to act in the world. So that's how Kluckhohn sees desires. Now let me give you my second definition, which is much, much, much less well-known. In fact, I don't think it's written down anywhere. And it might be less intuitive also, but it's very short. One night I was having dinner with my former colleague, the anthropologist Jonathan Friedman, and I realized I wasn't sure what my definition of desire was at that time. I was giving a talk the next day, and I said, Jonathan, how do you define values? He thought for a moment, he said, I think values are the way things tend to end up. He's disowned that. I mean, he hasn't said he doesn't agree or disagree. He claims maybe he never said it. So I could tell you I said it, or don't blame him if you don't like it, but I think it's great, so I give him credit for it. Values are the way things just tend to end up in a given social formation. People living in a society do all kinds of things, but in the end, they tend to routinely produce or reproduce certain things and certain states of affairs. And we can say that those things and states of affairs that are regularly produced and reproduced in a social formation are what the values of that social formation are. For example, all of us will end up doing things that reproduce the capitalist market, everyone in this room. Regardless of what our own intentions are, whatever our own sense of priorities are, regardless of what we find desirable, in Kluckhohn's terms, reproducing the capitalist market is just how things tend to end up in our societies. So one can assume that the market is a key thing this society values, even if no one in this room would quite say, well, that's a major value for me. That's the one we're going to end up reproducing. We're going to teach students who go out and work in that market. We're going to go to that market to furnish the necessities of our lives, et cetera, et cetera. That's just how our lives are going to work out. In Dumont's famous account of Indian ideology, I'm not talking about the accuracy of it here, I'm talking about Dumont's account. Despite all the varied things people might do and desire in caste society, they end up reproducing a system in which the production of purity is the highest value. Or we might follow Nancy Munn's very well-known analysis in her book, The Fame of Gawa. Gawa is one of the societies in the Masim district of Papua New Guinea that participates in the Kula Ring that Malinowski, of course, made famous. And Munn tells us that all kinds of things are important. They're desirable in Gawan society. Gardening is desirable, marriage is desirable, having big elaborate funerals is desirable, yam exchanges are desirable. They're all desirable in themselves, but ultimately they also all lead to what she calls the production of an increase in intersubjective space-time, that's her jargon, through Kula, or what Gowans themselves called producing more and more fame. All those things are important, but they lead to something even more important. They end up producing something even more important, and that's fame. the production or reproduction of the market, of purity, of fame. These are the ways some anthropologists tell us things end up in capitalist or caste or Kula trading societies. And on this second definition of value, it is by noting that things end up this way that we know that these things are what are valued in these social formations. It would surely have been cleaner, even desirable, come to think of it, to give one definition of value. But I've given two in order to make a key point that's going to shape the organization of these lectures. The two definitions I've given, that values are what are felt to be desirable by those living in a given social formation, and that values are also the way things tend to end up in a given social formation, these two definitions don't actually fit very neatly together. The first definition, Kluckhohn's, in terms of desirability, treats values largely as subjective phenomenon. They treat values as related to how people conceive of or feel about the world. Without people's subjective appraisals of what's desirable in the world, Kluckhohn would tell you, there would be no values to guide their choices. Without this subjective feeling of desirability, there would be no values. The second definition, the definition of values as how things tend to end up, by contrast, leads you toward objective observation. It assumes that an anthropologist can look at the things, institutions, or states of affairs that get produced and reproduced in any given social formation and determine the values which that society promotes without any recourse to arguments about what people living in that society think or feel or even how they make their choices. Kluckhohn's definition is about what's going on inside of subjects, and Friedman's definition makes no reference to that at all. It's something you could read off, things you could objectively determine about the social formation. Now, as it happens, this tension between subjective and objective definitions of the nature of values is a profoundly enduring one in this area of study across disciplines. You can find plenty of theories that assume that subjects create values by projecting their own judgments of what is desirable and undesirable onto a world of objects and states of affairs that on their own have no inherent value, that the world has no values in it. Subjects project those values onto the world. As I'll discuss in one of the future lectures, you can find a version of this position in Weber. It's not the only thing Weber says about values, but it is one of the things he says strongly and actually quite convincingly. And perhaps the most famous theory that roots values in subjective desires or desirability would be neoclassical economics, with its notion that the value of things is rooted in people's subjective desires for them. You can also find plenty of theories that assume that values are part of the world that subjects confront and respond to, that they're objective, rather than matters that individuals themselves create. Along these lines, consider Husserl, for whom this point can be made by studying the nature of human perception. Here's a short quotation from him. This is Husserl now. "The world is there for me, not only as a world of mere things, but also with the same immediacy as a world of objects with values, a world of goods, a practical world. I simply find the physical things in front of me furnished not with merely material determinations, but also with value characteristics. They're just out there in the things as we experience ourselves confronting them." Or you might consider David Graeber's definition of value as the proportion of a society's overall creative energy that it puts into producing and maintaining any given product or institution. His example is cars. How much creative energy does your society put into making cars? That'll tell you how valuable cars are compared to things into which it puts more creative energy and into things which it puts less creative energy. This is something you can determine without reference to anyone's subjective feelings or evaluations. Coming from America, I may not like to drive very much, but I still am in a society where a lot of creative energy goes into making cars. Okay, it's an objective fact about that world, and values, on Graeber's definition, are always objective in these terms. Now, generally, those who hold to objective views reject subjective ones as wrong-headed, and often as individualistic in their concerns with personal motivation and choice. Actually, Peter Berger and Roland Hardenberg have talked about Kluckhohn as an individualist thinker. Dumont himself was very concerned to distance himself from the Kluckhohn subjective view of values. You can hear him echoing Kluckhohn here. You can also hear him, I'm not sure he was quoting Jensen here, but he will sound just like the Jensen quote I used in the beginning when he says in his book on individualism, he says that the values that this is Dumont now, studies, quote, have nothing to do with the preferable or the desirable. What is desirable, if one insists, on using that word, is to act in accordance with the nature of things. The desirable is Kluckhohn, the nature of things is Jensen, but he's saying what's desirable is to do what the world objectively asks you to do. Okay, that's what's desirable. So generally, the objectivists don't like the subjectivists very much. Those interested in the subjective force of values, who mostly are not anthropologists, are similarly often unconcerned with the objective existence of values and the ability to structure cultural worlds. And they often assert that it is ridiculous to imagine that values exist anywhere but in the subjective lives of individuals. Probably the most famous contemporary version of this comes from philosophy, and it's called moral error theory, that says if you define values as objective things in the world that tell us what we should do, regardless of our subjective hopes or dreams or plans, then they are ontologically queer. They're the only things that exist in the world like that, so the chance that they exist is really, really slight, and therefore we should see values as just subjective. Okay, but there are lots of other strong defenses of desires as values as subjective, things that are projected onto the world and not really there. I bring up the fact that values have been seen as both subjective and objective, and that the objectivists tend not to like the subjectivists very much, and subjectivists tend not to like the objectivists very much. Because it's foundational to the theory that I'm hoping to try to develop in these lectures, that the tension between subjective and objective understandings of values should not be set aside. It shouldn't be set aside as simply wrong-headed. It shouldn't be set aside as naive. I think this tension is a sign not of incomplete understanding or of ideological mystification or of incoherence that we should just get past. I think it's telling us something about what values really are. The famous British psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott once said somewhere, but I have never been able to chase down where I read it once, though I promise you. He once said, breath. He said, breath is the one thing in the world we can't tell if it comes from inside of us and goes out, or if it comes from outside of us and goes in. We just can't decide with breath what's the real direction that it moves. Okay? I think values are a lot like that. I think we shouldn't force ourselves to decide whether they're really outside of us, and then we somehow learn to put them inside of us, or that they're really inside of us, and we put them out there in the world and then confuse them with real things. I could cite some classic social theorists making this point. Durkheim has some nice comments along these lines I could have quoted for you. So does Karl Mannheim, for example. But I'm going to end my remarks today by giving pride of place to an anthropologist, and even a living one, David Graeber, who in his book, Toward an Anthropological Theory of Value, tells us of the kind of a positive approach to subjective and objective views of values that I endorse here. I don't know that he actually follows this, but he does say this. He says, quote, value is a term that suggests the possibility of resolving ongoing theoretical dilemmas, particularly of overcoming the difference between what we can call top-down and bottom-up perspectives, between theories that start from a certain notion of social structure or social order, or some other totalizing notion, and theories that start from individual motivations. He says values could help us get beyond this divide between social structure, social order, and individual motivation. I wouldn't promise that this lecture is going to involve these very enduring social science dilemmas. You'll recognize them as what was once sort of culture or structure versus the individual, or structure versus action, and et cetera, et cetera. I'm not saying that these lectures are going to resolve that. I wouldn't be so naive as to promise that. But I do think that it's precisely because values have a kind of dual character, that they are subjective and objective, that they're a very good point of view from which to rethink these kinds of perennial issues. And I'm also going to suggest in the lectures to come that only by allowing these broad issues their space can I, at least, reach my goal of setting out the case for renewal of anthropological interest in difference, rooted in an anthropology of values that's theoretically adequate to the task of capturing both the objective, structuring quality of values and the force they exercise in people's subjective lives. So, Pace Ortner, I hope to show that the study of values is at least one kind of anthropology of the good that's worth pursuing now, even in these dark times. Thank you.